All right, so welcome back to Beginning with the Basics. Last week we got through one verse, and I actually realized it was only about half a verse, but it was good. We were talking about pre-fall stuff. We were talking about a very important figure in the Bible. Not important because we like him, but important because he's there a bit, Satan. So that was good. We took some time. And again, even though just to reiterate again, even though the name Satan isn't said here, we know that this is Satan because he is the serpent of old, and that he's called that a couple times, and he was the father of lies, both of which point to Genesis 3 at the time. Now, before I jump into Genesis 3, I want to answer a quick question. I'm not going to take a ton of time to answer it right now, but it's a question a lot of Christians I know have. And it's on radiometric dating. And radiometric dating is where we take samples of a radioisotope in a substance, and based upon how long decay it should have, we try and measure how old it is. And I don't want to take too long on this. I heard about the question just yesterday, but I want to take a few minutes and talk about this. One of the more common forms of radiometric dating, it's called carbon-14 dating. That's probably the one everyone's heard of, but there's many others out there. Now, the big thing I want to say about these is that they presume two things. One, that the formation of these radioisotopes was constant throughout history, or relatively constant. And two, that their decay was constant. Now, if we think back to the pre-flood time, this time right now, if you remember in creation, there was waters separated from the waters. And especially dating like carbon-14 dating, which is one of the quote-unquote youngest datings, like the most recent ones that we can use. And we actually use a lot of its readings to calibrate other of these radiometric datings. Carbon-14, which is what they're measuring, is actually formed in the upper atmosphere. And what happens is light from the sun hits, I think it's nitrogen. I can't remember exactly where it comes from. I think it's nitrogen. Hits the nitrogen, and it hits it just right where one of the neutrons turns into a proton. And that actually changes it from nitrogen to carbon-14. And it's not that stable. I mean, relatively speaking, it's not that stable. And that's, the carbon makes its way down to the atmosphere and gets breathed in by plants, animals, incorporated into their body. And then once they die, they're no longer breathing it in and incorporating it. So we say, okay, after they died, this is the max amount of carbon-14 they have. And then we measure, okay, how much do they actually have? Now the problem with this, again, if we think about those waters from the waters, that water would have blocked a lot of that radiation from the sun. And so the way we measure carbon-14 today is we assume that the formation we see today was pretty constant. And if it was much less back pre-flood, anything that lived pre-flood would automatically get dated as much older than it is because the initial levels were much lower then than now. And so already back then, even before it died, it would already have been dated much lower. And there's other problems with other radiometric datings, and I don't have time to go into all of them. The only other big thing I'll say, and we might talk about this more when we get to the flood, 2 years from now. But they also assume a constant process going on. But if you ever know about radiometric dating, pressure and contamination affects them a lot. And pressure, if we have a worldwide flood with lots of water on lots of these rocks and minerals, that's going to affect the decay rate. And if we have lots of water on these rocks and minerals and it's soaking through, there's going to be a lot of contamination. So again, that's, there's a lot more to say about that, but that's the basic idea why radiometric dating isn't accurate, okay? And there's actually some videos online. I'll try and link a few. If I can't get to them today, I'll try and link them in the video description about some of this stuff. Okay, so that was a question I had, and I know a lot of Christians have those similar questions. So that is a good question. All right, so let's jump back into Genesis chapter 3, and we're still kind of in verse 1. Today we're going to get to the temptation and the fall, okay? So let's read Genesis 3:1 together and get going from there. So, now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord had made. He said to the woman, "Did God actually say you shall not eat of any tree in the garden?" So, let's look at this temptation. And even the opening is very, very key, because the serpent opened by saying, "Did God actually say you shall not eat of any tree of the garden?" And that alone, he's already looking at the commandment and distorting it. He's casting doubt on it. It's not an innocent question here. He is lying, trying to cast doubt on God's statement by purposefully putting a false statement in there. He says, "Did God actually say you shall not eat of any tree in the garden?" Knowing that it was about a specific tree. And again, this is just planting that first seed of doubt. Now, what a lot of people have contention with, again, people looking at Christianity have contention with here, is that Eve wouldn't be familiar with the concept of lying. She had never encountered a lie before. This would have been the first time. And many people point out that because of this temptation is showing God as unfair, because he put Eve in a temptation where she couldn't possibly know all about what was going on. And it's true, she couldn't possibly know all about what's going on. Every time, the truth is though, every time we are tempted, it's slightly different. We have this slightly different temptation, okay? And it is, we can't know all about what's going on, but do we know enough? That's the question. There's an illustration. It's the way I hear it quite often said is for different points of application, but it's the same principle. It's the principle of someone learning to be a bank teller. Now, how do you train someone to be a bank teller? Well, obviously they got to know the math and everything like that, but what's one of the most important parts of being a bank teller? It's spotting counterfeit notes, because that's what people try and do. They try and pass them off. So how do you do that? You make them handle the real thing. You make them handle stacks and stacks of real money, counting it, organizing it, sorting it. And you do it so much until they're familiar with it. And then you test them. You slip that counterfeit in, see if they spot it. Now, I don't know if this is still true today, but I do know this is actually how they used to train them back in the past for spotting counterfeits. But the idea is here is that if you already are handling the truth, the real thing, you can spot the counterfeit just by seeing how it's different. So even if you're not expecting a counterfeit, if you're familiar with the real thing, you can just sense it by its differences. And so even not knowing about lying itself, you don't need it, even if you're not expecting a counterfeit, you just kind of count off money like normal, you will spot the difference. Now, Eve's response is just trying to correct the snake. Now, maybe Eve thought that the snake had misheard or was just merely mistaken with the commandment spoken. And maybe she didn't know if the snake was there for the first commandment or if it was, when Adam was, repeating it to Eve or anything like that. But Eve just tries to respond to it. Now, actually, I made a note here. I was going to say this earlier, but I made a quick note here. I just do want to point this out. Eve was not called Eve here. If you actually look at this part, she's merely called the woman. It's not until down in verse 20, after the fall, after the curse, that she is first called Eve. And based upon the context there, that's actually when she was named Eve. It's not saying, oh yeah, by the way, the woman's name was Eve. It's saying, no, Adam named her Eve right then and there after the fall. So she was actually called the woman at this point, and yeah. And so the one thing I do have to say about this is Adam is probably the only man in history who could say woman while talking to his wife and not get in trouble. Now, if we say that now, it's, oh, you're just, stereotyping me with all other women. But he could actually say that without getting in trouble because that was actually her name. Now, all that being said, I'm going to use the word Eve, the name Eve, to talk to her because that's where we're used to talking to her. So just realize that. Just wanted to point that out. So anyways, Eve could have thought the snake needed genuine correction. Okay, so she explains. The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but God said, you shall not eat the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die." Now, one of the interesting things I want to point out here about the idea of perfection in the garden. Now, perfection, the way the Bible is using it, doesn't mean no mistakes. Perfection in the pre-fall sense is merely talking about morality, perfect in their morals, perfect in their decisions. But it doesn't cover things like a perfect memory or a perfect way to communicate. And so we see this here. This is actually a mistake. And that doesn't mean that perfection isn't here. Because again, when the Bible talks about perfection, it talks about morality. So, because again, it had to have happened. Either this was Adam related the commandment to Eve and he miscommunicated it, or Eve misremembered the commandment, or something along those lines. But no one was purposefully misrepresenting something, but there was a fault between the communication from God to Adam to Eve. There's a bump in it, a fault, and that's fine. Because again, it doesn't contradict the Bible perfection of morality. So now, that unfallen bodies, we're going to have them someday. They were going to be far different from what we have today. But if we're looking forward to those bodies just because we want a perfect memory or zero need for sleep, we may be disappointed. Who knows? I mean, we might get that. I don't know how it's going to be in the new heavens and the new earth, but the Bible doesn't guarantee any of that. Again, it's the perfection is the perfection of morality. And obviously, in the new heaven and new earth, there's going to be no pain, no sin, nothing like that. And I don't think we will ever be actually disappointed. We will not actually be disappointed with our new bodies because whatever God gives us in our new bodies will be far better than we can imagine. But again, it might not include a perfect memory. Who knows? So anyways, looking at this, what was Eve's mistake? Neither shall you touch it lest you die. Everything else is really correct, but this was an addition onto God's stipulation. Again, we don't know if it was Adam or Eve who, if this was just a miscommunication, maybe Adam just told Eve, yeah, so we shouldn't touch this, and she took that as part of the commandment, or we don't know. Now, a couple more things before we get into some of this. First of all, the tree is not named by name, but that's okay because it's the tree. By context, we know it is, and if we look at the next few verses, it talks about knowing good and evil. So it's not named, but it is the name. It is the tree that is in the middle of the garden, so that's enough context for us to know it. Okay. After all, the tree of knowledge of good and evil would have been very important, so it being in the center of the garden makes a lot of sense. And I mean, if we think about that, people also complain about that. Why did God put the tree in the middle of the garden? Why not make it out of the way so it's tough to be tempted by it? But again, this was the one commandment from God. This was the one way where Adam and Eve could truly show their devotion for God. So having it there was actually a reminder of their love for Him, their choice to choose Him every day. So yeah. So second thing about Eve's mistake. Okay. Now, Eve's mistake, or Adam's mistake, I actually don't, but it was her mistake in replying here. Again, we don't know if it was Adam or Eve who first kind of facilitated this mistake. But this kind of mistake is a mistake we often make ourselves. What happens is we see God's law is so important that we don't want to tread on them. And so we put down more laws, more rules, more do's and don'ts about how to stop ourselves. But it is a mistake when we do that hard and fast, because even if the rule starts to be just for ourselves, our own way of avoiding temptation, it's so easy to say, well, it's good for me, it's good for everyone. And so we can elevate our personal choice up to a rule that is on par with God's commandments. I mean, for instance, don't get drunk with wine. That's the commandment in the Bible. But then we often think, well, then I just won't drink. Okay, if I don't drink, and if it's good for me, then probably no one should drink. And I hate to go off on this, but Jesus made wine. He made the good stuff too at the wedding. God designed this world for us to enjoy. Now, we need to make sure we are not being controlled by any substance. And don't get me wrong, there are substances out there that you can't use without being controlled by them. So we do have to be careful about some substances. Okay? But the point is that when we put in these boundaries, like Eve put in, or Adam put in for Eve, while they can be helpful for ourselves, we cannot elevate them to the level of God's rules. Now, again, if we have a drinking problem, you should avoid alcohol. Okay, and again, same with any sort of substance abuse problems. I myself haven't had alcohol for 9 years, but and the last time I remember having it was just me having beer with a friend. Okay, but I cannot say we have to avoid all alcohol at all times, because that is not a commandment from God. Anyways, that being said, this mistake is something we all make. Okay, it's not something that happens just happened once or twice in history. In fact, even the Pharisees did it. This was the actual crime of the Pharisees. If there's one thing that we would say is bad about the Pharisees, is they did the same thing. They took God's law. Instead of looking at it gracefully, they looked at it legalistically and basically said, well, if God will bless us if we keep his commandments, we'll put enough rules around them so we couldn't possibly not keep them. And then they applied that to everyone else. And then they said, oh, you're not keeping this rule. This rule is to keep you from God's rule. And so since you're not keeping this rule, you're not being holy. And through that, they missed the essence of it. God's law isn't about legalistic, because we know we cannot keep it. It's about the heart, okay? So now, getting back to Genesis, what Eve was doing here was nowhere near as far along as the Pharisees, and even what we see in some churches today with certain commandments. But in any case, these extra rules were getting equated with God's law. And that is actually the heart of what the snake strikes at. Okay, so Genesis 3:4. But the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. And so the seed or doubt was further placed here. You will not surely die. Now notice the snake didn't correct Eve's mistake of touching the fruit. Okay, he knew if he could get her to touch it, and she'd see that she's still alive, then she'd surely eat it. There's no reason to correct that. And again, this is part of the problem with putting rules like that on others. They see themselves breaking those rules, which are really just guidelines, that we should only have for ourselves. And since they equated that with God's law, they actually step and transgress God's law, and then they actually do see consequences. And some of those consequences can be very devastating. Okay, so back to here though with this. Now, the snake's reply in verse 4 is really interesting, because it's actually closer to God's commandment in some ways than Eve was. He uses the same phrase that's used in chapter 2, verse 17, where it says, die and you shall die. Now again, we translate that as you shall surely die, but really the word death is in there twice in different conjugations. Die and you shall die. This just has a negative in front of it. So it's basically not die and you shall die. That's what this is saying. And this is stronger language than even Eve used. But it kind of shows that the snake did actually know the commandment. He just is trying to manipulate Eve into transgressing it. And notice what he promises here. Okay, your eyes will be opened, you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. He has already cast doubt on the commandment, and now he's actually casting doubt on God's character. He's saying God doesn't want you to have this. He knows you'll be what you will become, and he has forbid it because he doesn't want you to have it. And the way he says it, you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. Okay, and again, this is a ploy that we see a lot of places today. Okay, and this has always been the devil's ploy. It's been to put other options out there besides Christianity to like muddle the waters, and B, for those who do look at Christianity, to cast doubt on God's character. There are people today, you can go online so many places, there are people today that will flat out say that the snake was right and God is bad. And because these lies are still being propagated today. They will say that God is evil and the snake was trying to get us out from under God's thumb. Okay? And saying things like it's good that we know now what good and evil is, that our eyes were opened. And again, Satan's still out there telling these same lies. And what's even worse is now we keep propagating them ourselves as mankind. Our sin nature, sometimes the devil only needs to, put the lie out there, and then we'll just spread it ourselves. He says, "Oh, you should want to be like God." Well, we want to be like God in his godliness, but I don't want to be God. We shouldn't actually want to be God, because I, for one, don't want to be the chief judge. I will be one of his judges one day, as wherever he appoints me, but I will leave all the ruling and decision makings of the universe to him. But there's that idea in our sin nature that just wells up. I want to be like God. I want to be more powerful. And even if we want to use it for good, we're still imperfect. We will mess up. All right. Now, okay. So the serpent says you'll be like God, and partially he is correct. Only Eve will be like God, but only in the regard of knowing good and evil. It's a huge change for Eve, and it's not really what she was expecting. After all, when you think about it, she knew good already, so she didn't have to actually know it. The earth and all that was in it was already very good. All she learned from this was evil. Now, you might have heard the saying out there, you can't truly know good unless you also know evil, or you can't know day without knowing night. You can't know light without knowing darkness. And it's true, but only to a degree. You have to know about it, but you don't have to experience it. Think about it like this. Do you exist? Do you know what existence is? Do you know what non-existence is? Well, yeah, we know that idea. Have you experienced it? No, you haven't. It's kind of ironic. You can't experience non-existence. But you don't need to. You don't need to experience non-existence to know what existence is. Okay? I don't need to be colorblind to experience what color is. Yeah. So we do need to know about it, but we don't need to experience it to know the difference. But this was a knowledge that was by experience. So, yeah, I mean, and even here, if Eve had not fallen, have not succumbed to temptation, she would have actually learned about evil, just without experiencing it. She was learning about evil right then, at that moment, in that temptation. Again, if she would have been able to resist, she would have still had left with the experience, with a far better appreciation with good, without having to experience evil firsthand. But unfortunately, we look at this, she was hooked. Look at this, verse 6. So when the woman saw the tree was good for food, and that it was delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took the fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then both their eyes were opened, and they knew they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. Now the temptation, as described here, is threefold. She perceived it was good for food, it was a delight to the eyes, and it would make her wise. And you can't help but imagine that this is what the Apostle John was thinking when he wrote 1 John chapter 2. I'm going to read verse 15 through 17. Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not from the Father, but from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever. So again, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eye, and the pride of life. For the flesh, she knew it was good for food. She knew what good food was, and you can tell a good fruit just by looking at it. So she would have known that it was ripe and good to eat. And then it delighted her eyes. So that's the pride of the, or the desires of the, sorry, I'm rambling here. That's the pride of the eyes, or the lust of the eyes, I should say. And then the last one, the pride of life. Okay, she desired it because it made her wise. And the thing is about this, it'd make her wise on her terms, not God's. And that's where the pride comes from. It's good to be wise. We just want to be wise on God's terms, not our own. So she took the fruit and ate. And then she offered it to her husband. Now, some confusion here. It says, she was with her husband. Okay, or the way it says, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her. Now, the with there does not necessarily mean he was there side by side during the temptation. One could hardly imagine Adam just standing there watching silently as she was having this conversation with the snake, as she went to the tree and took of a fruit. What's most likely is that Adam had to tend the garden. They were probably tending the garden just a little bit apart from each other. Might not have even heard the conversation, and he didn't notice until it was too late. So it could have been just other side of the tree, could have been around the corner, he didn't notice until after it happened, or he didn't notice until it's too late. We don't know. But he was nearby, and he was nearby enough that maybe as she was eating, he was by her side, even if he wasn't there for all the conversation. Now, this to me is, Adam eating is sometimes one of the most, I don't know, sometimes it's the most confusing parts to me of this story. Why did he eat? Why? And we don't know why. I mean, honestly, it doesn't describe Adam's motivations. All we know really about this is what it says in 1 Timothy 2:14. And it says that Eve was deceived, but not Adam. And so the question is, if you were not deceived, Adam, why did you eat? Now, there's some different theories out there. If you ever read John Milton's Paradise Lost, it's about pretty much everything up to the fall and the promise of Jesus. It's a very interesting, I guess epic poetry would be how you should describe it. But there's a scene in there right after Eve eats where Adam walks in, right after. It's like just after she just took a bite. And he could tell immediately that she had eaten. And he chooses to eat as well. And the reason he choose to eat is because he could not imagine a life without her. And he knew that she was already doomed to die. Now, good possibility, I can't think of anything better. But some people don't like that idea because it makes Adam's fall seem somehow noble. His love causes him to fall. But the thing is, even if that's his reason, even if his love causes him to fall, that doesn't make it noble. Because what he really did in that choice is he forsook, sorry, I can't speak today, it's been a long day. He forsook his first love, which was God, for another. And Eve was his wife on earth, but she was not to be his first love. Okay, so just as Eve selfishly wanted to be wise under her own terms, Adam wanted life with Eve under his own terms. And I always wonder, it's always one of those things that I think about is, what would have happened if just one of our first parents hadn't eaten? One to eat, but one hadn't, Could humanity have been redeemed from a sin nature with only just one of our two parents having been fallen? Now, it's just one of those things pop in my head. We can't know. But if I were to make a conjecture, I'd say I think we could. Okay, again, to be perfectly clear, this is a conjecture. Okay, I'll place exactly $0 on it on a bet, and who knows if we'll even learn about this when we get to heaven. But my thoughts are that there's a couple thoughts on this. First of all, if Adam is the head of humanity, not Eve, his unfallenness could have redeemed humanity. And honestly, the other way around could have happened as well. If you read in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, it's talking about marriages between believers and unbelievers. And Paul encourages the believers to stay married to the unbelievers, to not leave them. 1 Corinthians 7:13 and 14 says, if a woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. Now, holy isn't the same as redeemed. We're not saying that an unbelieving or a believing wife will redeem her husband. I mean, she can. We're not saying she will, but there is this holiness that is there. Also, Jesus was born without a sin nature while still being born of Mary, although that was a divine impregnation with a divine person being born, so not necessarily a one-to-one correlation there. But in any case, it's one of those interesting things I think about, and I think history it would be interesting to think through history if just one of our parents hadn't sinned. But they did, so that's where we are now. Now, the other thing I want to say about this, we're kind of getting near the end. It's very important not to blame Adam and Eve. I often hear people say I would have been better, if I was in the garden. And in that case, I usually quietly think to myself that it would have probably been some form of pride that would have made this person fall, make the same mistake our parents did. When the earth was cursed and death entered the world through this, that was Adam and Eve, but we still are responsible for our own sins. Each one of us does sin, and having a sin nature does not excuse us. So, yeah, it's important not to blame them. I say this sometimes just jokingly. It's like, oh, why did Adam do that? But we would have we can't blame him. Given the same situation, probably would have all done the same. Okay. Anyways, just to kind of close this up, last few things. One thing to note is that, yes, sin and death entered the world, but the world was not fully cursed yet. God is actually the one who's going to curse the world and change it. The big change here for Adam and Eve was that they got the sin nature, that death came into them. And because of that, their eyes were open and they saw that they were naked. It's interesting to think that while this condition was fine while sinless, them being naked was now shameful. We all come into the world naked. There's a vulnerability in nakedness. But at this point, there's no longer that perfect unity. There was a distance even between the first married couple. And more importantly, there's a distance between them and God. Okay, they had changed. Their spirits were dead. Dying that very day, they shall die. Okay, so their spirits died that day, and eventually they will surely die in their flesh. And like all of us, they try to cover their shame. Okay, imagine part of them knew it was inadequate. No way this was enough to cover them, these fig leaves. I wonder if somewhere in their brain they knew it was required, but refused to do it. Later we will see God clothe them with the skins of animals, because even here at the start, blood was required for that propitiation. And again, we did the same with our righteousness, our personal righteousness. Filthy rags, as the Bible calls them. Anything we try and do on our own will fail, because it's only through God's mercy and hope that we can please Him. So it must be Him who clothes us with His righteousness. And our part is letting Him do that to us. All right, so that's probably plenty for today. Next week, we are going to see what happens when God enters in, and we will see the full effects of the sin and the curse. So until then, have a good day, have a good week. See you guys.